Chapter 4. The trip to Fort Bragg was uneventful, and the children soon learned the ways of their new family. Margot, the same woman Betty Ann McGuire had kicked out of her kitchen a year before, seemed to have mellowed since her visit to Frederick. Brenda only caught Margot with a beer once, and that was out in the garage, the closest thing to a coal cellar Brenda could find. The children stayed in the house almost the entire weekend, aghast at the blast furnace intensity of the yard outside, so unlike the gentle breezes in Maryland. Margot was perpetually in the kitchen, offering the children trays filled with cookies and cakes. "Would you kids like one of these?" she would ask in her broken English. Junior and Brenda accepted these eagerly at first, but 15 minutes later Margot would inquire again. The children grew to dread the lady's persistent appeals, even fleeing to the bathroom and locking themselves in. Once inside, they compared their confections in whispers. "Bren, do you want my cake?" Junior asked hopefully. "It's awful sweet. I ate 3 this morning, and Mrs. Campbell keeps giving me more. Won't you please eat one?" Brenda shook her head vehemently. "Nuh-uh, Junior, you eat 'em. My stomach hurts already. She doesn't fix 'em like Grandmother, does she?" Junior ventured another nibble to be sure, then voiced his final opinion. "She uses way too much sugar." "But she tries so hard, Junior. It's not her fault she can't cook as good as Grandmother. And she only drinks a little bit now. I saw her," Brenda replied. "I don't want to hurt her feelings, but these cookies taste awful. What are we going to do?" Junior looked out the window, then seized upon an idea. "Why don't we feed these to the dog? Daddy says he's a German shepherd. I'll bet he'll love this cake, made like in his own country and all." "Sure," Brenda exclaimed. She pulled 2 more cupcakes from a pocket on her dress. "I'll give him some of these. They're raisin nut cake, I think. What a great idea." "I don't know, Brenda Jean," Junior said, reconsidering. "Maybe that'll be too much for him to eat. What do you think?" Brenda gave him a mischievous grin. "Nah, he'll love it." The children bolted out of the bathroom and out the front door, choked with laughter. Louis was hardly seen by the children in the first few weeks. They knew of his presence by listening from their beds at night. Louis often argued with his wife, and the arguments became increasingly punctuated by mysterious thuds and noises downstairs. One night in particular, Brenda correctly identified 3 plates breaking in the kitchen, and what was probably an ashtray thrown against the living room wall. Moments later, she heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, stopping outside her door. "Brenda?" "Yes," the girl said meekly. Brenda was startled by the softness of the voice she knew as Louis, in contrast to the huge shadow of his form in the darkness, and Brenda could see his chest heaving with deep emotion. "Did you want to say good night, Daddy?" Brenda exclaimed, hoping to calm him. Louis moved into the light, and his look was horribly stern. "Turn over," he said tonelessly. Brenda put away her books and crayons and placed herself face down on the bed. Next, she felt Daddy reach under her, feeling for the buttons and zippers on her shirt, unhooking each one methodically as he worked his way down. Louis had pulled her skirt and panties off, throwing them into a corner. She felt cold. She heard the clinking belt sounds Daddy always made when he took his pants off. She wanted to whimper, but Louis' jerk of her ponytail squelched her growing fear. Brenda remembered Daddy's first visit to Frederick. She remembered the summer with Aunt Pat, and suddenly Brenda knew her daddy had come to rape her, like the last time. She tried to forget the weight as he wrapped his arms around her, then forced his legs between hers, his heart running its race as before, hardly pulsing faster than his erection. The girl blinked, her eyelashes rasping against the bedclothes, hearing his exhausted laughter as her head reeled from the ferocity of his attack, and she realized that her daddy had not changed at all. Afterward, Louis seemed to have calmed, and Brenda stared at him as he pulled his pants back on. "Daddy?" she said, lifting her head from the scattered sheets. Why did you do that to me again? Lewis turned and, to her amazement, caressed her face gently. I told you years ago. I love my little girl, and I want to make you very happy. This is our little secret. No one else will understand if you tell. He rose and stepped lightly to the door, stopping before opening it. Don't be surprised if I come to see you again tomorrow. Just remember, no one will understand. The next night, Lewis did visit his daughter, as he said, and the night after that. The frightened girl did not tell the secret to anyone, but hoped that Lewis' anger would go away and that he would hurt her no more. She prayed that God would show Lewis a better way, or at least a less painful way, to love her. She wondered how much more affection she could tolerate, and kept hoping for a change. Not long after, Lewis had not yet unbuckled his belt when Brenda sat up in bed, attempting to divert his attention. Daddy, can I ask you a favor? Yeah, what is it? His voice in the darkness responded. The next time we go to Frederick, can I bring Whitetail back home with me? What's that? Lewis replied impatiently. You know, Whitetail, my bicycle. Oh, sure, baby, we'll get that. Don't you worry. Brenda breathed a momentary sigh of relief. Now, shut up and turn over. There were 2 visits to Frederick that year, but the bicycle was never retrieved. The next year, it was also left behind, and finally, she stopped asking for it. As if a chapter were closing on her childhood, news came that great-grandmother had died. Upon arriving in Frederick for the funeral, Brenda saw that her grandparents were greatly upset and disturbed by great-grandmother's death. The thought occurred to her that perhaps they needed her with them. Life with father was nothing like Brenda had imagined it to be. Her quest for a good daddy was ended. All she wanted now was out. As the children were piling back into the station wagon for the trip home to Fort Bragg, Brenda moved close to Lewis, nudging him shyly. Daddy, can I ask you a favor? Lewis swung the last heavy suitcase onto the roof, turning as Brenda spoke. Yeah, what is it, kitten? We haven't much time. Daddy, can I stay here in Frederick with Grandmother and Granddaddy? Lewis looked hardened, his eyes becoming vacant and glazed as he looked down at her. What the hell kind of question is that? I don't know, Daddy, I just thought. The last words never left Brenda's lips as Lewis' hand caught her across the face, sending her sprawling to the ground. Don't you ever ask such a stupid thing again, you understand? Lewis' features were distorted with rage, his nostrils flaring as he raised his hand again. Yes, Daddy, I'm sorry. Brenda stumbled to her feet as Betty and John approached, not seeing what had just happened. Brenda looked up at her grandmother. Betty Ann had opened her mouth slightly, mouthing Lewis' name, but that was all. Only Brenda saw Betty's fist clench. Only Betty saw the pleading in Brenda's eyes. Good, Lewis exclaimed, slapping the girl on the back as she got up. I don't ever want to hear such talk. On the way back home, Brenda was devastated. She cried for hours on a pillow Grandmother had given her, sleeping only long enough to resume crying. One of the few people on earth who loved her was gone, and the chance to live with the remaining 2 was shattered. Brenda knew that from now on, she would be trapped in a situation she could not change. For the first time in her life, she felt utterly alone. The sting of Lewis' hand had hardly faded, yet it was nothing compared with the pain of leaving Frederick. Brenda could almost taste the wrenching, tearing feeling that told her the last flicker of hope had gone out. When Brenda turned 11, Lewis was sent to Vietnam. She spent those gentle days walking out in back of the house to a large meadow, and she was astonished at the pleasure she felt at the simple things. The twittering birds, the fresh air, the waving flowers. It was freedom, though Brenda could not name it. The meadow seemed huge, never-ending, like those in the Van Gogh paintings at school. The brown, waving grass was so tall and thick she could lay down in the midst of it, and a person passing within 5 feet would never know she existed. Brenda picked her way along an overgrown path to the open mouth of a barn. During the summer, the heat of the day seemed magnified by the multitude of shrubbery around her, producing a stifling heat. The sun was almost overhead in the cloudless sky. This only made the prospect of the cool recesses of the barn that much more inviting, and Brenda walked faster as she approached. She spent many afternoons daydreaming in the old stable. Brenda sat in the huge hayloft and sighed, remembering the wonderful days in Frederick. The memories of her father's attacks were fading, leaving her with a vague and constant depression. Brenda crawled on all fours across the hay-strewn upper loft, feeling her way gingerly, moving towards a ladder against the far wall. Her eyes focused upon the wall. She did not see the telltale widening cracks in the floor that indicated another trap door. Too late. She grabbed for a crossbeam as she fell completely through the mattress of straw. Brenda felt only the emptiness of space as she tumbled to the dirt floor below, and then blackness. Later, a single blood-curdling scream echoed from the interior of the barn. "Why am I screaming?" Brenda wondered inwardly, propping herself up on both arms. She had a blinding headache, and her heart was pounding. "What is it?" she asked again, and then she remembered. Oh yes, the dream. Brenda looked uneasily towards the open barn door, as if to catch the last trailing black filaments of the dream as it vanished outside. The girl glanced at her wrist, then remembered she had no watch. An instinct told her that several hours had passed. The slanting sun coming through the wide cracks in the dilapidated building indicated the day was far spent. Brenda mentally checked each joint and muscle before she got up, noting a burning sensation across her thighs. As she staggered to her feet, Brenda noticed the broken section of mirror leaning against the rusted hinges of the open door. She stared into it, fighting to regain her balance and her vision. Her head had a little blood on it, but the entire front of her dress was torn, and everything from the waist down felt curiously bruised. Brenda tried to remember what had awakened her in such a fright. If it had only been a dream, it would have still been horrible, jerking her out of a troubled sleep into a cold sweat. There was the image of someone evil prowling the land, an image of blackness moving across the grassy landscape, coming upon a sleeping girl in a barn, viciously spreading her legs apart and raping her, then hurrying off to find new clothes, lest some passer-by see the evidence of his act all over him. Brenda looked again at the bloody tatters of her skirt, and she knew it was not a dream. Sobbing, the girl grasped the remains of her skirt in one hand, while holding her blouse closed with the other. The gravel driveway was empty as she approached the house. Good, she thought. Only Margot would be home. Brenda and her stepmother did not get along very well. The shy 11-year-old could feel the harshness in Margot's beady eyes, framed behind the square lenses of her glasses. The screen door slammed just as Margot was coming around the corner with an armful of clothes. The sight of the girl in the doorway was pathetic. Anyone else would have been moved with compassion. Margot blinked, then narrowed her gaze as she spoke. "Well, what in the name of God?" she murmured under her fetid breath, dropping the clothes on the couch. "Mom," Brenda pleaded, I don't know what happened to me. I was playing in the loft out back. I fell out and I woke up like this." She let the sentence trail off, unable to continue. "I told your daddy not to buy you all those goddamn frilly blouses. You were always such a big girl, Brenda. People can't help but notice." Margot's voice trailed off as she looked again at the little girl before her. The torn dress, the bright red splotches on the front. Not possessing exceptional intelligence, even Margot guessed this horse of a girl had just been raped. Her frown turned into a smirk, the closest thing to sympathy Brenda ever saw on her stepmother's face. "Did anyone see you?" Margot ventured, adjusting her glasses as they perched on the bridge of her formidable nose. The girl shook her head. "Good," Margot continued. "You get washed up. Thank God nobody saw you. If the MPs found out, the news would be all over the base. Our name would be ruined. I'll write your father. You just get cleaned up, Brenda." Dazed, Brenda staggered into the bathroom, dropping her tattered clothing into a heap. Her own reflection seemed to mock her. "Stand up, Brenda. Look at yourself. What new mess have you gotten yourself into?" "You have no backbone," Margot would often exclaim. A refugee from wartime Europe, she never lost the Germanic brogue. "Living with your grandparents all those years, while your daddy struggled alone. Now you come here, as one of the family, and expect to be treated like the rest of us." Brenda never bothered to mention that the transfer from Frederick was wholly Louis' idea. Margot would not have listened. She possessed the unique ability to select those facts pertinent to her beliefs and ignore all others as unnecessary. "Oh, grandmother," Brenda thought, turning away from the mirror. "Oh, grandmother, why did I ever leave you?" A week later, Brenda was playing outside, riding her new bicycle. Louis had grudgingly relented and bought his daughter the dilapidated, rusted thing. Brenda was amazed at the ugly hulk, utterly devoid of any character. There had been love in her old bike, Whitetail. Granddaddy had worked with it for weeks before presenting it to her. This one was ancient, pulled from a trash heap. She sighed as she swung her leg up around the high saddle, then grimaced with a stabbing pain. She crumpled with the bicycle to the ground. Brenda lay in the dust, her head throbbing, waiting for a head to appear in the windows of the house. No one appeared. She raised herself to one knee, then noticed another blotch on the front of her skirt. Her eyes widened in horror as she clutched the soggy material. "Mother!" she screamed. "Help me!" Her cries at last brought movement from inside the house. Margot trudged down the concrete steps into the yard, a dish rag in her hand. "What's wrong with you, Brenda? What's that screaming?" "Mom, look! My insides are coming out! Oh, please help me!" "Nonsense," the woman replied, sniffing for a moment as she stooped to examine the stain. "You started your period, that's all. God knows I should have seen it coming, as big as you are. The only 11-year-old who looks 15. Well, come with me back into the house. I can get something for that," she said, pointing below the girl's waist. Alone in her room, Brenda moaned softly to herself as she rocked back and forth on her hands, looking out the window at the moonlit landscape below. "Oh, God," she cried, gazing at the ceiling as if it would open at her request. "Why did you make me a girl?" She hugged her stuffed animals from Frederick, talking under her breath as she stroked their ancient and balding fur. "Oh, God, I don't want to be a girl. Why can't I be a boy? Why can't I be like Teddy?" She held the old bear upright, turning it slowly as she inspected it. "I could be just like Teddy, sewn up neatly all around, with a happy face on the outside all the time." Her eyes looked like mirrored ice-blue crystal in the deepening twilight. Tears streamed silently down her face, each one a diamond on her cheek. If she anticipated notice from some celestial being, there was none. No answer was given but the steady gleam of the luminous clock by her bed and the rasp of the summer locusts outside. At last the girl stretched her long, sleek body across the coverlet, and directing a final prayer to the ceiling, fell into a deep and merciful slumber. She dreamed of beautiful things, and of a world so unlike her own. One dream occurred often. There were azure skies, spotted with uncounted depths of fluffy white clouds. The sun was near the horizon, whether rising or setting she could not tell, casting an ever-changing array of orange, crimson, and purple across the heavens. She lay in the middle of a boundless field, watching the fading stars and an occasional meteor that darted across the sky. She became aware of a presence behind her. A melodic voice called her by name, and a hand touched her gently. Turning, Brenda saw an angelic being she thought of as the Virgin Mary. The face changed, but the eyes were always the same, gentle, all-knowing, all-forgiving. I'm not worthy of your love, Brenda would say, but the being stood, thoughtful, unmoved. Forgive, the being said, and Brenda thought of her father. No, he hurt me, I will not, Brenda cried, as she recalled the pain of Louis' nightly visits. Then a feeling of utter calm washed over her. The images of humiliation she had carried so long seemed to float upwards and vanish into the night air, along with her tears. Thank you, Brenda said, raising her eyes to the being, but she was alone in the fields. Louis returned from Vietnam by Thanksgiving. Louis gathered the children around the dining room table that evening, passing out souvenirs to each one. Lawrence, Junior, and Alan received alarming-looking machetes, armbands, and shoulder patches. The girls were given terry cloth robes, real Vietnamese chopsticks, and incense burners. Brenda's lips were a grim line as she watched her father distribute each trinket. His very presence terrified her. As he handed her the robe, Louis' eyes betrayed nothing. No emotion flickered across his massive face as he gave her a perfunctory hug and kiss. How much did he know, she wondered? What had Margot told him of the barn incident? The dinner conversation remained inconsequential, and afterward the usual lethargy gripped Brenda. Louis and Margot took their usual places in front of the television set after dinner, while the other children went to their rooms, allowing Brenda the privilege of the house cleaning. She washed and dried the dishes, loaded 2 bundles of dirty clothes into the washer, then went to her room. Today was a light day. The dusting would be done on Thursday, the vacuuming on Friday, and the kitchen wouldn't need to be mopped again for at least a week. She closed the door to her own room by 10 o'clock, listening to the distant chatter of the television. At 11, the door opened again. Kitten, are you asleep? She had indeed been sound asleep, but at the sound of the familiar voice her eyes flew open and she lay absolutely still beneath the covers. Come on, I know you've been waiting for your daddy, Louis purred, closing the door behind him as he spoke. Brenda buried her face in her pillow, staring at the formless clouds of purple that swirled before her eyes. I am asleep, she chanted to herself. He can't hurt me if I'm asleep. Baby, you know your daddy still wants you, still needs you. Brenda clenched her hands until the fingers turned blue, fighting to keep the sound of Louis' voice outside, away from her. Brenda? The words whistled harshly in the darkness as Louis grabbed the girl and in one single motion wrenched her arm sideways. Brenda felt the tearing pain and, knowing the limb would break in another moment, flung herself on her back. Come to me, damn it, he hissed. At that instant, he was no longer her father, but an intruder. The charade was useless. There would be no sleeping now. Brenda felt the familiar hands upon her thighs, her breasts. She felt consumed by the cold desire upon her. No, Daddy, no, she protested weakly, at last staring into the darkness above. Why not? Louis replied, his face a hideous grin. Your mother already told me you're a woman now. Besides, this should be better than a barn. The terrified girl stared into the moving darkness, her eyes luminous with tears, whispering as each breath was forced from her with the lurching of the bed. Our Father, who art in heaven. Why couldn't she stop it? Why did her mind keep whispering that it was terribly, terribly wrong? Her nightly questions were never answered. Sometimes she would ask Louis before he left her, and he would only say, It feels good to me. Doesn't it feel good to you too? She could never understand her father's words. She tried more often to read the expression in his eyes. After a while, she stopped searching her father's face for the answer that would not come. Each night, Brenda stared at the ceiling and waited for it to stop moving, many times not bothering to pull her dress down when he finished. She waited for sleep to come so she could close her unseeing eyes and dream, and ask the unanswered question again in her shallow and worthless slumber. One day in the spring, Brenda walked to the bus with Teresa Owens, a friendly girl with a dazzling smile. Being a new girl at school, Teresa knew nothing of Brenda Campbell, the quiet girl, the strange girl, the one who never invited anyone over to her house. Hence, Teresa was an ideal sounding board. An easy dialogue sprung up between the two, broken only by Brenda's periodic lapses. "Bren, what's the matter with you today?" the younger girl asked, peeling the wrapper off another stick of double bubble. "Oh, nothing." Brenda looked straight ahead, ignoring the narrowed eyes of her companion. "Come on, Bren, you can tell me. What's bothering you? You've been acting like a zombie all morning." Brenda dropped her gaze, as if deep in thought. Breathing heavily, she clasped Teresa's hand, looking at her intently as she spoke. "Trix, if I ask you some things, will you tell me the truth?" "Sure," the other replied, blowing an enormous pink bubble in assent. Brenda drew nearer, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Does your dad, play around with you a lot?" "Sure," Teresa replied. "We wrestle sometimes." Brenda tried to picture her dad pinning her hands down with one hand while the other pulled off her underwear. "Wrestling?" Teresa continued. "When I was little, we would play horsey, and I rode on his back." Brenda remembered this part, though the roles were reversed. "What does your daddy do with you?" Teresa asked. Underestimating the atmospheric pressure, the last question was momentarily lost in an explosion of gum. When Teresa had pulled the gooey mess from her face, her companion was gone. Obviously, friends had no easy answers. Brenda spent hours in the library, searching out answers to her questions. The hours turned into days, the days to months, months to years, but no book relieved her torment. It was as if what her father did had no right or wrong, no pain or pleasure, no good or bad. Junior was no longer her secret friend. Margot often kept them apart. She said it wasn't good for them. Brenda recalled an early incident when Margot was staying with them in Frederick. The children were playing outside when Brenda tripped and fell on the back porch, tearing a bloody gash in her knee. Margot appeared at the back door, but not before Junior had rushed to his sister's side and cradled her in his arms, kissing her tenderly. Brenda never understood the baffled look on Margot's face or the sternness in her voice as she spoke. "Stop it," she said brusquely. The children stood frozen in each other's arms as Margot grabbed for Junior and pulled him roughly aside. "You're too old to hold your sister that way. Go into the house for a Band-Aid." From that day on, the children were afraid to touch in Margot's presence. A little wedge had been driven between them, and each year that passed, the wedge grew wider. The little boy Brenda remembered standing resolutely by her side at Aunt Pat's no longer had second thoughts about leaving his sister. The years away from Frederick had taken their toll. Junior had grown sullen and moody in those 4 years. His coldness shocked Brenda, but still she tried to understand. When older buddies beckoned, the image of spending pleasant hours alone with his sister now seemed mundane and hopelessly boring. His friends offered fast cars, parties that lasted into the night, and girls who were more impressed by Junior's lean, dark looks than his sister, who recognized it for the surliness that it was. "Junior, will you help me move this dresser into the hall? Daddy said Elizabeth and I could have it, since Lawrence is joining the Merchant Marine next month." "If it's Lawrence's, let him help you," Junior shot back at Brenda. "Last time I touched any of Lawrence's stuff, he slapped the shit out of me." Junior glanced at the front door, then back to his sister. Brenda's eyes were pleading, but she did not speak. She would not beg. Junior's face changed subtly. "Come on, move it yourself, Brenda Jean. You can do it. Besides, I got to meet the guys in another 20 minutes. I'll help you move it this weekend." A car honked outside. Through the blinds, Brenda could see a red convertible almost too small for the squad of football players that sat on top of it. "Well, see you, Brenda Jean. The guys are here. Let me know when you want to move that thing." Junior ran a slender hand through his gleaming oiled hair as he turned and walked out the front door. Neither Junior nor his sister saw the smile on Margot's face as she stirred a pan of gravy in the kitchen. At home, the grueling schedule of housework continued. In fact, since Brenda had just turned 14, it escalated. She vacuumed, she dusted, she cooked supper when Margot and Louis were too drunk to do it. Brenda was in charge of all clothes for Lawrence, Jr., Dorothy, Elizabeth, Alan, Mom, and Dad. As time permitted, she was allowed to wash her own wardrobe. It was as if Margot blamed her for some wrong, and housework was the penance. One day, carrying another load of clothes from Dorothy's room, Brenda stopped in her sister's doorway. "Dorothy, why don't you help me with the clothes?" The elder girl had propped her feet up on the coverlet of the bed, where her toenails were receiving another coat of polish. "Gee, I'd like to, Bren, but I've got a French club meeting in 30 minutes. Brenda sighed. "Last week it was the math club. Then it was the drama club. I didn't even know you liked French." Dorothy smiled wickedly. "Who said I did? One thing for sure, it gets me out of the house. Lawrence does it too, or didn't you notice? When Mom and Dad start drinking, I get really nervous. I just have to get out. Maybe you ought to try it." A week later, Margot was surprised to see her stepdaughter come home early after school. Margot was putting the finishing touches on a roast, one of her best dishes, when she chose to cook. "What's wrong, Brenda? You sick or something? I thought you worked in the counselor's office after school." "Yes, ma'am," the girl replied carefully, extending a yellow slip of paper as she spoke. "It's just that I found out about this really neat gymnastic club that meets twice a week. All I need is for you to sign this paper." Margot eyed the paper, then the girl, suspiciously. "Isn't the counselor's office enough, Brenda? I think you spend way too much time away from home." Margot tasted the juice from the meat one more time, then sprinkled more pepper on it. "You say I'm supposed to approve of this? Well, I will not do any such thing. You spend too much time away from here already. Go on, what are you standing there for? I just finished a load of clothes in the dryer. Go on and hang them up for me while I finish this roast." Brenda stood silently, still holding the paper. "But you let Dorothy and Lawrence go to school clubs." Margot turned and brought the ladle down flat across Brenda's outstretched arm. "Don't you talk back to me, you little bitch! You think I do as much for you as my own kids? Remember, Brenda, you are not my child. Your father and I got along fine until he brought you and Junior into this house. You are lucky to have a roof over your head. Now get in there and do as I told you." The afternoon shadows lengthened across the windowsill as Brenda carried an armful of Dorothy's clothes down the hallway to her room. Dorothy was still on her bed, listening to the Top 40 hit parade. Brenda looked in upon this scene, noting Dorothy's unopened school books and her other reading material, a dog-eared copy of Tiger Beat. "Dorothy, you've been in here all afternoon, haven't you?" Brenda asked archly. Dorothy turned the dial on the radio. "Yeah, it's been so boring today. Hey, Bren, listen to this song. Isn't it creepy?" Brenda retreated into the closet, hearing the familiar strains of Last Kiss. "Hey, Bren, don't the Drifters sing this song?" "Nope," came the muffled reply. oh, where can my baby be? The Lord took her away from me. She's gone to heaven, so I've got to be good, so I can see my baby when I leave this world." Brenda moved carefully in the cramped closet, dodging the heat from the light in the ceiling. Dorothy wrenched the volume knob another quarter turn. "Hey, Bren, this is the part where the guy has the car crash and warm water running in his eyes, isn't it?" Brenda stuck her head out of the closet, a fistful of coat hangers in one hand. "Dorothy, any idiot knows he's talking about blood, not water. He was in a car wreck, remember?" There was a pause as Dorothy assimilated this information. "Mom, come here," Dorothy screeched. Margot came to the doorway, a beer in her hand. "What's wrong, Dorothy?" Dorothy pointed across the room. "Brenda called me stupid, Mom. She just did. You should have heard her." Brenda reappeared with her hangers, about to voice a rebuttal, when Margot caught her above the ear with the palm of her free hand. Stunned, Brenda fell against the bedroom dresser. Dorothy giggled impishly. "Don't you ever call anyone stupid, do you hear, you little bitch? Just because I didn't sign your paper doesn't mean you take your hate out on my children." These episodes occurred with regularity, only the circumstances changed. Another day, Brenda was folding a load of clothes in her room. Elizabeth, the youngest girl, had offered to help. Brenda accepted this help graciously, knowing that Elizabeth sought out her older sister more for advice than companionship. Brenda snapped the bedspread as she laid out the linens for the younger children's room. Elizabeth was helping by keeping the bedspread from becoming airborne while Brenda worked. "Bren, what was it like for you in 7th grade? Did you like a lot of boys?" "Uh-huh," Brenda said absently, smoothing another blouse. "Oh, Bren, I won't sleep a wink tonight. I can't get Richard Tompkins off my mind. I think you know his older brother, Carl. Don't you think he's just wonderful?" "Aren't you a little young to be worried about boys, Elizabeth?" Brenda asked with a smile. "Oh, Bren, I just lay here imagining him and me together in our pajamas. Ooh, I tingle just thinking about it." Brenda picked up a skirt. "Pajamas on? Is that the best you can do? I hope your husband has less on than that, otherwise you'll have a hard time making babies." Elizabeth recoiled in mock horror. "Why, Brenda Jean Campbell, what a disgusting remark. That's just about as gross as Mom and Dad sleeping naked or something." "Didn't you know?" Brenda said sagaciously. "Dad never wears pajamas. Never has. Now, are you going to help me fold clothes or not?" An ear-splitting scream echoed across the room. "Mother! Brenda Jean is talking filthy language in here." Brenda was in the bathroom until midnight, dressing an ugly gash on her face from Margot's ring finger.